Apparently, JRPGs were difficult. At least that's what people thought in the early 90s. In the early days of the Nintendo Entertainment System and Super Nintendo, tons of localized Japanese video games were given the easy mode treatment. The most notable being Final Fantasy IV, or 2, I guess. Difficulty adjustments happen in localization all the time, but Final Fantasy IV went hard. Status ailments all curable by one item that now costs basically nothing. HP values chopped into fractions, hidden passageways made visible. It was so radically different that it got re-released in Japan as Final Fantasy IV Easy Type. Should I be offended by this? JRPGs at this time were not a major player in the US market. Sure, games like Dragon Quest and the original Final Fantasy made a little splash, but the sales numbers were only a fraction of games like Super Mario World, Sonic the Hedgehog, The Legend of Zelda, or any number of platformers that came out week after week. So in an attempt to bust into the West, after the okay sales of Final Fantasy II, Square Japan decided that it was time to lock on and get America. Perhaps a game with minimal reading skills required that literally advertised itself on the box as a entry-level role-playing adventure. After all, in the 90s, D&D was still just for nerds.
Look, there! It's Tiamat the Dragon!
And so we were given Final Fantasy Mystic Quest, also known in Japan as Final Fantasy USA. Okay, that's definitely an insult, but it looks like their strategy didn't work out too well. Sales were lackluster, reviews were lackluster, the gameplay was also kind of lackluster. Some go out there and claim it's the worst Final Fantasy, which is ridiculous when this exists, but it was my first Final Fantasy. Heck, my first JRPG and a game that I can't get out of my brain. You never forget your first. So yo, it's Austin, and today we're gonna deep dive into Final Fantasy Mystic Quest, a game that holds a very special, very weird place in my heart. It's a game I learned many skills from, such as basic subtraction and reading, but not anywhere near as many skills as I learned from today's sponsor, Skillshare. Skillshare is an online learning community for all of the creative types out there who have all come together, millions of them, in order to teach and learn new skills. It's a great place to learn new things and dive further into your creativity. I, like probably every one of you out there, struggle with little bouts of unproductivity, which is probably why I only upload once a month sometimes. That's why I recommend checking out Thomas Frank's Productivity for Creatives. Build a system that brings out your best. There's a lot of advice on changing up your environmental efficiency, and I can genuinely say that's helped me out a lot. 2 uploads a month now, we're doing it. There's a wide array of classes you can take for just about any topic you can think of, say gaming, because hey, this is a gaming channel. There's plenty of things related to gaming, be it development, writing, character design, and storyboarding. Skillshare is curated for learning, meaning that if you have a subscription, you'll have unlimited access to the entire catalog of classes to learn from at your pace. There's always something for you to do today that you couldn't do yesterday. So today, the first 1,000 subscribers of mine that click the link down in the description are gonna get a free month of Skillshare Premium. That's unlimited access to exploring your creativity. Thanks to Skillshare for sponsoring the video. Now back to obscure JRPGs from 1992. I am an SEO god. Okay, so Mystic Quest. It's hard to overstate how unpopular JRPGs were outside of Japan in the late 80s and early 90s. Mystic Quest was the 3rd Final Fantasy to hit the States, despite being the 5th, technically. One at a budget price of $40 USD. That's $80 in 2021 bucks, by the way. Imagine paying $80 for this.
There is no such thing as a coincidence.
In Europe, this was actually the first Final Fantasy to come out under the name Mystic Quest Legend, with Final Fantasy Adventure, or Seiken Densetsu 1, being released as simply Mystic Quest. Nothing quite says Seiken Densetsu quite like a random suit of armor and sword on the box. The early Western days of Final Fantasy were pretty confusing. I've prepared this handy diagram to explain it all. Okay, moving on. Mystic Quest is really interesting because it was the first time Square decided to do an actual spin-off for Final Fantasy, and it was solely for the purpose of introducing more North Americans to the concept of JRPGs. It even came out stateside first, which was a rarity for Square in those days. Despite the critical acclaim a lot of the early Final Fantasies got, the sales just weren't there, with Western numbers being a mere fraction of their Japanese counterparts, even if the box still claims that it's the world's best-selling RPG series. I feel like Dragon Quest might want a word here. Heck, if you put Mystic Quest up against Square's other Super Nintendo releases, there's a very, very clear difference in quality and reception. It's also the only affordable SNES cart here. Ah yes, $200 for Chrono Trigger. Good God. I think all of this makes Final Fantasy Mystic Quest stand out in a really weird way. Now, the concept of the entry RPG would be more successful a few years later, not with Square, but with Nintendo's wildly popular Pokemon. It turns out kids are super down to play RPGs, they just gotta have cute and cool monsters to collect as well. I guess an anime, card game, and media blitz doesn't hurt. Mystic Quest didn't have any of that, but it did have Benjamin, the hero of legend, Benjamin. Or Austin in this case. Unfortunately, Final Fantasy Mystic Quest has become a bit of a meme, being regarded as one of the worst in the series, an embarrassment. It's heralded as Final Fantasy for babies, and well, I actually think that Mystic Quest did its best to try and do something totally unique, succeeded at it, and that is part of the problem. Is it good? I'll get to that, but we gotta start at the beginning.
And at that beginning, I don't think Mystic Quest was originally a Final Fantasy.
If you look at the developers on Mystic, you'll notice a distinct lack of Final Fantasy names. No Uematsu, no Sakaguchi, no Amano. But if you look through the credits, you'll see a lot of people who worked on a Game Boy game called Final Fantasy Legend 3, or by its actual Japanese name, Saga 3 Jiku no Hasha. Same directors, writers, and composers. These people would work closely with the American offices of Square, who altered Final Fantasy IV to make it easier in order to ensure that Mystic Quest would be totally accessible to children. In fact, this game is nearly an asset flip, as a huge amount of visuals from Legend 3 would be repurposed, redrawn, and colored into Mystic Quest. What about Chocobos? Nah. The Final Fantasy Prelude? Nope. What about anything resembling the 4 Final Fantasy games that came before it? Sure. Crystals. There you go. It's Final Fantasy now. You did it. Just like the one anime with the butt laser. So maybe it's a spin-off in name, but the series is known for huge narratives. Prior to this releasing, Final Fantasy IV's massive quest with Cecil in the game set a new standard for role-playing games as a whole. It showed that you could evoke an emotional response from a video game with a story of love, betrayal, and redemption all shoved into about 600 kilobytes. At the very least, you could expect this kind of story going forward with a franchise called Final Fantasy. So what's Mystic Quest got? Let's see, there was an earthquake, my village was destroyed. Hey there kid, you're the warrior of Knight of the Prophecy, I think. Go save the world. Eh? I guess that's just how it be. Ah yes, the Knight of the Prophecy. A child who still gets allowance. Mystic Quest has a bit of a Saturday morning cartoon vibe going on, and I think that's something that gets drowned out by the clearly lower production budget in comparison to, say, Final Fantasy IV, Ode 7 Extraordinaire. But it does have plenty of funny moments that feel kinda incomplete. I love how this kid's village got completely destroyed along with, presumably, his family, friends, and everyone he's ever known, but he's like, gabagoo! And well, that's how it starts. From here you travel from village to village, solving a myriad of problems and meeting characters that join you along your journey. There's a little empty slot on the bottom of the screen for any time a character joins your party, each of which are very different and various levels of useful, but all of which have a crazy amount of artwork done. For some reason, this game had different artists make official art in different regions for every release of this game. So the American, European, and Japanese releases all have not just different covers and names, but art. We've got Kaylee, the 15-year-old axe-wielding forest girl. The original Japanese art is very reminiscent of the Final Fantasy IV and V Japanese box arts that were a weird era of Final Fantasy. The style coined by sprite artist Kazuko Shibuya that never really made its way to the States. Instead, we just got like font and a sword. Sick. We've also got Phoebe, who was my favorite as a kid. Maybe it was the fact that she kind of reminded me of Deedlit from Record of Lotus War. I love the massive shoulder pad design, but she was a badass adventurer who filled an archer role. There's the mercenary Tristram, who's basically a ninja. He's got that Shadow the Hedgehog personality, you know what I mean. Damn. Then lastly, there's best boy Ruben. 16-year-old baby boy Ruben, still living with his parents and running around in cool looking fire armor while wielding a morning star. I love the Japanese art here in general, and I always thought that Ruben came off like a Ronin warrior or something. Anyways, here's the European art. Ah yes, Ruben, the 16-year-old baby boy who still lives with his parents. All of the European art feels like someone took a 2nd edition D&D book and said, this will do. Granted, it's better than the official art from the Western Strategy Guide, where it kind of looks like I drew it myself. It's kind of funny looking at the game, seeing the context of the characters' ages, the intended look from the Japanese developers, and then looking at this epic painting of Kaylee being poisoned by the evil tree in the first 5 minutes of the game. Also, yes, that's it's supposed to be Benjamin. It's a bit of a difference here, huh?
If Square was trying to get younger people to play RPGs for the first time, then they probably shouldn't have made all of the assets look like a deep magic card for Key to the Kingdom. I'm sure nobody knows what I'm talking about.
Anyways, Benjamin and these 4 central characters meet up at various points throughout the journey in order to heal the world, defeat the Vile Four, and free the 4 crystals of the earth. So it's got a 4 fiends thing going on, making it only tangentially related to Final Fantasy as a franchise. No Moogs, no Chocobos, no Sids, no da-na-na-na-na-na-na. But okay, the music in this game is top tier. Anyways, sorry, I'm still thinking about Ruben's face. Mystic Quest does a very poor job at making you connect to any of these characters who do have pretty decent designs. Prolific Square translator at the time, Ted Woolsey, stated that Mystic Quest was one of the easiest jobs he had working for them due to the fact that, well, there wasn't much to translate. There's like 3 or 4 lines before a character decides to join your party, and then like 3 or 5 more before they just saunter off. In fact, it wasn't even until after I was done with Phoebe in my party the first time that I learned that she's a bit of a moron, messing around with bombs and completely destroying a cavern her grandfather lives in. Though you're barely able to tell because the cutscene, quotations cutscene, just looks like they walk away. The budget, it's not John Cena, especially when put up against some of the epic scenes from Final Fantasy IV. Actually, as a whole, despite being released after 4, this game just feels like a step backwards, especially when it comes to some of the gameplay, which we'll get into here in a second. There's a lot of potential here with the cast, but they just kind of let it slip through the cracks, which isn't just unsquare-like, but unlike JRPGs in general. For instance, when Ruben gets knocked off a bridge and you're like, oh shit, is he dead? And he's just like, nah, it's cool, dog. I'll catch you later. Then when you meet up with him later, he talks with Phoebe like they know each other, but that's not on screen, and it doesn't even make too much sense considering they live in completely different areas in the world. But it's fine, look, everyone's cool friends, even if half of the characters spend their time bedridden from poison or an overwhelming amount of wounds. I mean, Kaylee literally jobs out at level 3 to some Minotaur, but comes back a few hours later at level 31, great axe in hand, ready to go and smacking dudes for 4 digits of damage. There's a lot of suspension of disbelief you'll need for everything going on here, but I mean, who's sitting around playing Mystic Quest and being like, actually? Just me, probably. It's a shame that the system only allows for you to party up with 1 person at a time, because I think the potential for party mechanics and personalities working together in a fun way is definitely there. The Saturday morning cartoon vibe exists in just about every major cutscene after the initial, well, someone dying from poison angle. Well, let's just say that there's not a single moment in this game that mirrors the depression known as Final Fantasy VI's World of Ruin.
I don't think that Mystic Quest gave you much to think about or a narrative that will really stick with you, which is, I guess, to be expected. But in an era where Final Fantasy was totally innovating battle systems with active time battle, how does Mystic Quest play?
So we've said a million times already that Mystic Quest is the, quote, Final Fantasy for beginners. Not in the 15 sense, but still. I think that this game has the bones for a very good and unique combat system. It uses a magic system more similar to Final Fantasy I or Dungeons & Dragons, where certain spells have a certain amount of usages as opposed to a central mana pool. You have the ability to use any of the weapons you find along your journey, and experimenting with them is how you're supposed to exploit enemy weaknesses. For instance, some dudes are weak to axes, some are weak to swords, some are weak to fire or whatever spell. In fact, this is one of those rare games where you can not only do serious damage to, but instantly kill undead enemy types with healing spells. My favorite old trope that no one does anymore. Just let me cure the bosses to death, it's so good. Or you can just hit attack over and over. Yeah, that'll do it. Mystic Quest gives the player so many tools they can mess with. Black magic, white magic, wizard level spells, 4 different types of weapons, bombs, swords, axes, and claws. But for the most part, all you'll need to do is just hit attack over and over, and every enemy you'll find will just fall over. All status ailments are healed with the same ability, and for once in a video game, your partners are pretty smart. You can switch any of these party members between automatic and manual, and on auto, they liberally use healing items to make sure you don't die. They also come into your party at a static level that'll carry you through the entire section that they're in. So unless you're paying attention, you won't know that your claw weapons also inflict status ailments, that your swords make you attack faster in the turn order, or that you can even target area of effect with spells. It's really weirdly choosy about explaining what certain items do for the player, but in return, dumbs down the difficulty of the encounters so that all you have to do is mash the A button anyways. It's really weird, like they had the makings of a battle system with depth. In fact, you can play this game more strategically, but there's just no point when it's wasting time in comparison. Just to test my theory, I put my partner on AI and mashed a single button through a bunch of fights back to back, and well, everything was fine. Also, if you die, you just restart the battle anyway, so you can just mash A, fall asleep, and maybe you'll get it. Good job, guys.
But what about outside the combat? Are there any other Final Fantasy staples like dungeons, overworlds, or a grind? There's no such thing as a 90s RPG without grinding. Test me.
Mystic Quest has an overworld, it's just like Super Mario World instead of Final Fantasy. You follow a lane to whatever destination you want to reach with no random battles. In fact, there's no random battles in this game whatsoever. Just about every enemy appears on the screen for you to fight, and that's fine, I don't dislike that. But on the overworld, you'll run into little areas marked battlefields where you can fight 10 battles back to back in order to gain experience and money quickly. Literally a grinding spot, and sometimes there's 2 or 3 of them between your next destination. You can skip them. I don't know why you would. It's teaching kids to run around in one spot to gain experience at an early age. Oh, they were just prepping kids to play Final Fantasy XI like a decade earlier. Good thinking, Square. LFG Dunes Party. On the other hand, I actually think that the dungeons are well designed. Prior to this, Final Fantasy dungeons were just point A to B affairs with maybe a switch to hit sometimes. Mystic Quest took more of an adventure approach to them by incorporating your weapons into exploration and progress. Sometimes you'll have to bomb down a door, which uses one of your active items, by the way. Maybe you'll have to poke a switch with your sword, cut down a tree or mushroom with your axe, or climb up the side of a mountain with your claws. I love how the game teaches you how to use these by showing Benjamin falling to his death, and then Phoebe's like, look at this newbie, try these out, I'm the coolest. This continues to escalate with more and more items that have dual usages in battle and on the map, and it just seems like a missed opportunity to dive deeper into. Instead, Square just filled up the dungeons with a lot of enemies. And I mean, a lot of enemies. You don't have to fight them all, but well, I'm thorough, and I will kill every single one of them for minuscule gains on my XP bar, whether I like it or not. Boss fights are a different story though. They play with a lot of status ailments and high damage dealing attacks, so typically here I would control my partner to make sure we didn't die. The fights were never too difficult for me, the 30-something-year-old man, but I could see a younger kid imagining this battle to be a huge affair, and well, as a child I did. One of the big things that helps Mystic Quest as a whole are the multiple sprites that every enemy has that shows their health percentages. It's something I would love to see more video games as a whole. You know, the merman's about to die when he starts pogging out. Some of the boss animations are great, like when the dinosaur bones are practically just a pile on the ground but still fighting you. It's good stuff that carries the weight of battle into a glimpse of victory, showing you what's about to happen as opposed to just literally seeing it. Look at this guy, he's melting. It's great.
Mystic Quest is filled with a ton of small touches like this that actually do elevate the experience quite a bit. You can really see the potential just oozing out of it. But it seems like Square's insistence on dumbing down the entire experience was a fatal blow to its entire reception. I beat this game as a kid, but then I moved immediately onto Final Fantasy VI, but that's not really fair. That's like comparing market research to a masterpiece. Then you go and get stuck on inputting Saban's blitz combos in the tutorial where they appear for the first time, and you suddenly are like, oh, okay. Yeah, children are dumb. I am dumb. So you get to the city of Windia that has been oppressed by wind, I guess. It's here when, oh no! Chocobo spotted. Guess it's Final Fantasy after all. So you climb up Pazuzu's tower with Kaylee to be thrown the one and only deadly mechanic in the game, the Psych Shield, which reflects magic damage back to the player. The only time in the entirety of Mystic Quest, including the final boss, where you have to be careful about what you do. It seems like they just didn't know how to properly balance difficulty with this thing, or that they didn't trust the player to be able to take care of themselves. If they did a party of 3, they could have had a bit more flexibility with killing the player more liberally, but also 2 AI partners would have carried you the entire way. By the time you get to the final tower, climb up all the way to find the Dark Lord himself, it still feels like you're just not being challenged in any capacity. Most of the boss battles are simple enough for anyone. Just make sure you heal yourself and you're good to go. Oh, also make sure to poke the Benjamin statue and get a ridiculous amount of items before the fight, so there's no way you can fail even if underleveled. Yeah. Then when you finally conquer the final boss with an awesome song, by the way, the old man reappears again, reveals himself to be the Crystal of Light, one capable of awful puns, and then sets you up on a journey to the end credits where you'll say goodbye to all of your new friends, have Tristram sneak onto your ship, and view yourself floating towards the horizon, in a scene that looks 100 times better than the rest of the game.
where was this budget elsewhere? Like when the massive tree carried you across an entire forest and it just looked like this. This game is all over the place. It's really simple and basic in some ways, but then it shows hints of complexity and not explaining anything to the player in others. It gives you the option to play smart, but there's no need to when you can just mash your way through every encounter. This game seems half-baked and potentially maybe more of a marketing experiment for Final Fantasy than a video game. I just don't really understand why Square thought it necessary to dumb down their games this much for a Western audience. Maybe they thought the reason they weren't getting sales was due to the perceived difficulty, but if you look at some of the highest selling NES games, that's clearly not an issue. Look, Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles in the top 20. That game, that's the hardest game. I think the reason this exists is because Japanese RPGs were just unfamiliar to Western audiences. It's not about difficulty. Though, imagine these people trying Nocturne. They would kind of remain that way until Final Fantasy VII took off running. Games like Chrono Trigger and Super Mario RPG were huge catalysts into making the genre a bigger success, but it's clear as day that not every JRPG is gonna be a hit here. Heck, just look at Dragon Quest. Americans don't like Dragon Quest. I don't know why. Probably because we lack taste. But overall, I don't think that Final Fantasy Mystic Quest is a bad game, nor do I think it's the worst Final Fantasy. I think it's a decent learning tool for really, really young people to experiment with video games, and honestly, in the year 2021, where mobile RPGs are everywhere, it's not even close to the bottom of the list of RPGs for beginners. A lot of those games literally play themselves, and at least Mystic Quest makes me, I don't know, navigate a labyrinth? Think for a second? There's a lot to like with Mystic Quest. The character designs are really cute, the soundtrack is outstanding through and through. The main theme motif is catchy and has several variations depending on where you are in the game. The battle theme is killer, and the boss theme, good God. Some of these tracks are so good that they actually made their way into Final Fantasy Theatrhythm's arcade cabinet, one of the only times that Square Enix has actually even acknowledged this game's existence. And hey, maybe it's best remembered exactly for that reason. Final Fantasy USA. I'll always remember Mystic Quest purely for being my first Final Fantasy, my first JRPG, and the game that was the gateway into the complete nerd I am today. Is that a good thing? Maybe, maybe not. But it's because of Mystic Quest that I was able to understand stuff like Suikoden 2, Final Fantasy 9, Wild Arms 3, Grandia 2. It's an introduction to interfacing with hybrid control scheme video games that aren't just platforming, but aren't just menus either. But the burning question, should anyone play Mystic Quest in 2021? Probably not. Although at like 6 hours long, less if you frame skip through the ridiculous amount of battles, it could be a decent afternoon dive for the sake of history. After all, now that the Wii eShop and Virtual Console is gone, this is no longer accessible anywhere. It's a piece of, at least to me, interesting history locked onto a $20 cart that's gonna get harder and harder to find as time moves on. And considering Square Enix seems to be really weird with porting older Final Fantasies these days, I don't see it ever coming back. Seriously, what are you guys doing with the sprite remasters? I just want to play 5 on my PS5 with trophies. Come on, come on. And that was Final Fantasy Mystic Quest, a game that's important to me, and probably nobody else, but it's one of those games that seems to end up in the vat of critical failures that so many games are finding themselves in these days, things that are gonna get forgotten. Hopefully this video has shown you another side of the story of a smaller ragtag team at Square trying to make something work with the big franchise without any of the big names, and I think they succeeded in what corporate wanted, just nobody else. But no worries, all they had to do was wait another 14 years and no one's gonna wanna play JRPGs for an entire generation. Unless you want to play Enchanted Arms. Anyone want to play Enchanted Arms? Anyways, I've been Austin, and next time I'm going to be talking about Oni-chan for real. I swear, there's a lot more games than I thought. Special Patreon shout out to Blackfoot Ferret, Darren Newton, GM Pinks, Nick Irving, Zach Porter, Pete Funk, Ryan Talbert, Kevin Zanowski, Jordy McCaffrey, Kieran Arter, Brandon Howell, Chris Shelton, David Molnar, Irrational, Donnan, Jay Roos, Jacoby Fitzpatrick, Christopher Olivia, DX Buster, Eli Shane Stalfanecker, and Legend Gary. Thank you all so much for your generous support. Love Final Fantasy. Is it clear? I don't know. I got a special thing coming up pretty soon. I'm gonna be announcing in my next video. Should be a good time, and expect streams for real. All I have to do is rebuild all of my assets. Yay! Okay, good morning, good night, go to sleep.